We'll slip into this presentation fairly quickly if this works. Yes, it does. So this, as you all know, we've had an absolute shocker of a year with grain production, and this summarises things very well. It's from ABARES, and it shows you the East Coast production of grain in blue, and when I say East Coast, that's New South, Queensland and Victoria, and we're comparing that to the wheat production in WA and South Australia. And you can see over here we've got the 5-year average. WA, SA normally just pip us in the long term. 16-17 we were pretty much level pegging. Last year it was drier in Queensland and New South Wales in particular, but sorry, that was the year before, but last year, an absolute shocker, as you know, with the East Coast production probably about a quarter of what it was back in the big year of 2016. So what does that mean? It means that the whole logistics supply chain for grain in Australia is turned on its head. We've never seen anything like this before. Thank God we've got Western Australia, because for our livestock industries we wouldn't exist unless we had access to grain from WA. If you look at barley, it's a very similar scenario. The production there in the East Coast still terrible and dependent on 3 or 4 million tonnes of grain coming around the coast in bulk ships into the ports of Brisbane, Newcastle, Port Kembla and more recently Melbourne. We've had about 3 or 4 bulk ships call into Melbourne to keep all the livestock industries close to Melbourne going. So normally, as you know, the grain industry in Victoria relies on the grain in northern Victoria going down to the port of Melbourne or Geelong, road or rail, put it on a bulk ship, send it to some of the biggest export customers, which are invariably Jakarta, Indonesia. There we need to be competitive with prices of grain from North America, but increasingly it's the grain that's coming out of Kazakhstan, Russia and the Ukraine, which is the cheapest grain in the world and damn good quality too, coming all the way through past Istanbul, the Dardanelles, Mediterranean, through the Suez Canal, the other side of the world. It's still the cheapest grain in the world, and so that's who we need to be competitive with. This year, of course, and last year, our grain was heading north to keep all those livestock industries going up in the north, and we need to be competitive for our grain in northern Victoria with whatever it costs to bring the grain around the coast from Port Lincoln or Esperance or Kwinana, and correspondingly that grain is also going to be priced against what the Indonesians are going to pay and what their potential customers are going to be prepared to sell to them as well. So we are still involved in a world-priced market where futures matter, but it's in a very, as you can see, convoluted kind of a way. So futures go up, grain growers in Western Australia want more money for their wheat and barley. So giving a bit of a snapshot of what the situation is in the world. Do we have lots of grain? Are the prices going to continue to go up or down? This is the number of days of stocks we have in store at the end of the season, and it's a great proxy for whether the prices are going to go up or down. So at the end of next season, this is showing here that the wheat stocks are going to be about 130 days worth of consumption. If there was no more production coming in, you keep chewing away at it, it'll last 130 days. Now that is, relatively speaking, pretty good stocks compared to what it's been. It's coming down a little, there's a trend for it to come down. This line here is corn. That's also pretty reasonable terms long term, but it's in a sharp decline. The barley stocks are an entirely different story. They're heading down. They're vulnerable to a supply shock and price rise. There's some other things going on with barley, like our customers don't want much of it, China and Saudi Arabia. But the yellow line here is soybeans, and they're a proxy for canola, the oilseed market, and they're pretty level pegging, you've got to say, by looking at that price there. So no supply shocks expected. With grain pricing from 85 through to today, the big droughts really tell the story. 7-8 here. This is where we hit just before harvest last year, and we've come off substantially since then, but it's a steady increase over that long term. Drilling down to more recently, this is a maize price here for April delivery for Melbourne, and you can see where the maize price has tracked since it started trading in November. Big rise with the hot, dry weather in January, and it's starting to taper off since, more in line with what's happening with wheat and barley pricing. They've probably lost another $10 since Monday. There's been some big price falls in global markets. So we've got wheat prices here. They've come off about $40 since harvest. Barley is in free fall, relatively speaking. That's really falling away much more rapidly. So that's encouraging if you're a consumer. I'll skip through this one. So the things that will keep things bullying along with grain prices, we do have declining stocks. We're not growing any more grain East Coast until harvest, apart from a bit of maize. The demand is still going up to Queensland. We are locked into whatever the Western Australians are going to be charging. And you do have some industries that can still buy grain and still make money at the current grain prices. There's not many, but they can. The bearish things that will push prices down, one standout here is that there is very poor optimism that the US and Chinese are actually going to get their heads together and resolve their current trade dispute. A lot of corn, a lot of soybean, alfalfa, hay, they've all got big tariffs, and they still beating each other around the head. But we are losing demand big time, particularly in northern Victoria with the shrinking dairy herds up here. So that is taking away the demand for stock fed mills from supply of pellets and mash. I'll get into the hay markets now, and a bit of an overarching snapshot here of the 3-month rainfall decile map showing big dry in the territory. It's their wet season, and their cattle need pastures up there. They want fresh feed. And continuing drought here in southeast Queensland and central Queensland. Put the overlay of what's happened since then. This is just the first half of February, and that massive rain that devastated the cattle industry in far north Queensland, absolute shocker. And it really is a glaring purple blob there. But this is, and I think my crystal ball estimations, cattle are probably likely to come in from the territory to take advantage of that feed that's going to be available here as a consequence of that flush of rainfall. The farmers, the stations will be keen for adjustment, and the cattle at least are coming the right way for the markets. They might be still livestock export out of Townsville, but that's going to alleviate the need for cattle from the south to go up, and it probably means that hay prices here are still going to see the same demand. I don't think this influence is going to impact the hay markets down here. As far as cattle movements are concerned, we're still seeing cattle coming out of the north of Victoria down into Gippsland. That's reducing the herd here, but at least they're still going into production down south. But as far as hay is concerned, as you probably know, the hay going north started April last year. It started earlier this year. They're starting to move hay up there to keep their core breeders going into the Liverpool, Western New South Wales and feedlots on the Downs. But as other hay movements are concerned, you've got a trickle of stuff coming across from Western Australia, which is a bit of an unusual freight movement because it's really not a competitive commercial freight leg to move hay all that distance, but it tends to be the charities that do that big lift across the Nullarbor like that, which are working in an uncommercial sort of framework. The snapshot of hay markets, it tells the story of droughts again and tells the story of big wet years down the bottom here. There's 10, 11, you know, there's 16, 17. But we hit record levels last year. We've never seen hay prices as expensive as they were. They've since come back substantially. They're probably around $3.20 is a mid-range cereal hay price delivered to the Goulburn Valley, but it was unprecedented to see hay hit those prices. Drilling down a bit closer, the more recent markets, cereal hay is the blue here. We've probably lost about $100 a tonne since that peak. The green here is canola hay, which is tracking, started the same as cereal hay, but it's lost ground since as the apparent quality of canola hay fell away. We had an opportunity to capture early sown, or rather early mid-flower canola, get it at really high protein, high energy, but canola growers are very optimistic that they're going to get a rain next week. The rain didn't come, so they cut their canola anyway. It was late flower. It's stick in string, it's 30% sort of cows don't like it. So the variability of canola hay out there is enormous, and if you're buying, you'd probably be well aware of that. But canola hay has added a very useful volume of hay to the whole supply scenario in this corner of Australia. There's probably a couple of 100,000 tonnes there that you wouldn't ordinarily expect to be made. And what does that mean for the overall, how much hay do we have? Is it short supply? And no one really estimates these things, but I'm having a stab. These are ABARES statistics here until the latest published ones, 16, 17, and these are my estimates for the last 2 years. Underlying here is the cereal hay, which has been 15% of the entire wheat and barley area of Victoria was cut for hay last year. Low yields, admittedly, but you've got a decent quality hay there. You've got your canola hay coming in here, but the standout here is what's happening with pasture and silage. And you've got above average production of pasture and silage in Victoria, certainly not up here, but down south they are having a cracker year. But the contribution for the northern markets, this is the northern markets here, Goulburn Broken is where we are typically. That is primarily coming out of canola and the cereal hay that was cut in this region. By the way, these are the last 6 years total hay production represented in each of these bars for each of these regions. We've got Riverina and Murray regions represented as well. But again, another standout is how huge the production was back in 16-17. Those standout green things there were more hay than we could possibly use in 1 year. And we all know the story, it was carried over, and thank goodness it was, because that's when the Queenslanders and New South Welshmen came out down here and took it up north to keep them going. Down south, you've got probably above average hay production. They've had terrific hay and silage season down there, and they hope they don't need to come up to northern Victoria to buy hay. They know it's expensive, but they're just keeping their head down, hoping the autumn break comes nicely timed and they can just chip on through the way they are.
Colin, can I just, those two graphs there, what's the relativity of that graph to the other one? Are they producing more hay in the southwest compared to up here? I bet the same.
So the scale of the two graphs is the same. Yep. They're both 1.2 million up the top here. But I think you've raised a good point, Rob. Okay, here we've got 5 different regions, and you'd say they're about 500,000 each if you average them across. But if you look at the south, whoops, where are we? Look at the south, that's the north, I'm sorry. I got it the wrong way around. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 regions. They're probably averaging around 400. The point I'm trying to get to is there is a hell of a lot of hay made down south of the Divide. We think north of the Divide we all grow a lot of hay and it's the centre of activity. You know, there are massive, massive tonnes of round bale pasture hay and silage made down south that impact the whole supply scenario. If there's short production down there, you look out. Hay prices will go up, you can bet on it. But this year, that sting in the market's been taken away. Big production down there. And this has gone across into South Australia as well. Lower Southeast has had a very good season. They're doing very well. Hay exports, I don't know whether there's many cereal hay producers here, but if you are a cereal hay producer and you're not in export, you should be. It's an expanding market and there's some very good options for you in terms of contracting. We've got 8 plants in Victoria with the red marked here. A couple of new ones coming in at St Arnaud and Raywood. But Gornong is the nearest to this part of the world, and also Yarrawonga and Tokamal. It's a story of success, really. There's been a phenomenal change in the market that started in the mid-80s. It's been progressively growing. You know, we send 1 million tonnes of dead grass in containers out of Australia every year, and it's a pretty impressive industry to sort of see that volume is actually successful on the world stage. Japan in the blue underpins our market. China in the red here has been expanding. That was 2018. In a drought year, we still increased their total exports out of Australia. So we're doing quite well. Admittedly, a lot of it comes out of WA, but South Korea is expanding. They're out there contracting at 240 delivered plant for new crop, top grade hay. There'll be top ups on that, but typically not everybody can achieve that top grade all the time, so you need to take off probably $30 on that as well. But the logistics of hay has changed in the last few years. Here's a map of New South Wales road train routes that come knocking on the door of Victoria, Mildura, Robin Vale, Swan Hill, all looking for a consistent network to match up. And it has been matched up, extending down to Beulah here and across to the South Australian border. But in the last couple of weeks, they've extended that again, going down to Horsham and from Warwick-Nabil through to the South Australian border. So the logistics of getting big lots of hay out of Victoria into New South Wales is getting very sophisticated, and that can get your freight rates for full payload hay down very aggressively. So from a consumer point of view, that's a bit of a threat, I suppose. But it's a terrific opportunity if you're in Western Victoria.
When you say road trains, do you mean triple trailers?
Double road trains.
Double road trains, so a little bit bigger than a double, but not a lot. Correct, yeah, exactly. What's the difference? 41 goes to 56 tonnes, I think it's something like that. Yeah. You go from a 45-foot trailer and a 30-foot hay trailer to 245s.
Correct, exactly right. Hay quality this year has been a story of mixed results. Firstly, the canola hay averages, and this has come from feed test in Werribee. The average protein for canola hay this year is actually lower than what it was the last time we made a big lick of canola hay, which is disappointing because of a lot of late cut canola hay. So it's pretty patchy. The energy is lower as well. The good news is, of course, that the wheaten hay is fantastic, as it often is during drought stressed times. Terrific protein, terrific energy, contrasted with the rubbish we had back in 2016, which was a consequence of a very wet year. Just going to finish off on the threat with drought hay is that it has a lot of sugars, nodes that often don't cure properly. It's exposed, you've got a lot of hay out of sheds grown by people that don't normally have hay. It can get wet, it can get hot, all the elements that spell spontaneous combustion. So some growers around Kerrang have got these things working. Look, we can send remote space vessels to Saturn, but we can't work out what the heat is inside a hay bale. And this is Fred Flintstone technology, but it works. Stick a 1 metre Rio rod in a bale, keep moving it around, test if it's hot on the end. Doesn't matter whether you're a buyer or a seller, the hay is still vulnerable. This is a very, very vulnerable hay. And you keep moving them around. If you don't find any hot spots, just move them around. It's cheap, takes a bit of time. Paint some things on the end so you don't get them thrown out on the back of the baler or back of the truck. It works. Couple of last slides. The energy content for hay is surprisingly competitive when you cost it against wheat. Wheaten hay and canola hay, both around the same cost of energy on a cents per megajoule basis. So you can't fill your cows up with hay, of course, but you can still get the access to it as long as the fibre level is under control. An example of quality, you're a dairy farmer, you want to buy canola hay. I've sold you on the idea of canola hay, you want to go out and buy some. Here's a nice cheap lot that's advertised online down in the Wimmera, 230X farm, 4x3 bales, 580 kilos, 12 protein, 6 ME, a little bit of colour in the images provided online. Think, you wouldn't expect that, it's cheap enough, I think I might buy that. But you can contrast that with another lot that is advertised. They've got a biscuit shown online. You can still see the yellow flowers from when it was cut, so it's actually cut really quite early in the flowering phase. 330X farms, $100 more. 640 kilos, it's in a shed, protein 20, energy 12, red hot quality. But what's that all mean when I get it home? What's it going to do for my cows? If you're paying fixed dollars per kilometre for your freight, it's going to cost you $5 a tonne more to get it home to the Goulburn Valley, but it's going to cost you a third more for your energy, for your protein, and it's going to cost you 60% more for your energy when you bring it all back to what it is that you're actually using in your cow. So the more expensive hay is going to be a better option if you can get your cash flows organised. I'll flip through the grain things here, but the prices for next year I've put in here for some gross margins, which you can look at a later stage. But the thing that I want to point out here is that because if prices have been high this year, they're not necessarily going to be high next year. Faber beans, 1100 you can get delivered in Melbourne now. Next year, it won't be that high. If we have an average year, it's going to be way back. So don't consider necessarily assume that it's going to overplay for next year's cropping. It's going to be a very different scenario. Cereal grains are obviously going to be back. Canola, you can get those prices for wheat and barley today, but the other ones are a bit more of an educated guess from my side. A lot of the traders won't even tell you their best ideas next year. So your take-homes, stocks are low at the moment, but that increases your vulnerability for prices moving up. Buy according to your own risk profile. Grain prices are certainly in a downtrend at the moment, but it all depends on the weather, and not even the scientists can give us a good idea about when that autumn break is going to come, so we're in no man's land there.